Well, can you believe we are at session number 70 in Mark? When you get a regular length book, it takes a little longer than 10, 11, 12 sessions to get through it. Unless, of course, you're going to skip through the do and not do any details. You're going to, what I call, do a survey of a book by flying 30,000 feet above the territory. I like to use the term, well, if you're going to fly over Nebraska at 30,000 feet, what do you learn? The answer is very little about Nebraska, anyhow. But if you do it 100 times at 30,000 feet, won't you learn more? And the answer is probably not. You may not learn much of anything beyond the first time. But if you get your feet down on the ground, the boots on the ground, as the phrase goes, and you get down there and you walk across the state of Nebraska, you will learn much, much more. So that's what I consider looking at Scripture verse by verse, chapter by chapter, through entire books is all about. It's getting the boots on the ground and making connections that will allow your knowledge to be usable. If you read Scripture only, you don't study, you don't think deeply about it, but you just read it, you probably will make very few connections between verses. And if you do that, the knowledge that you have is not accessible to you when needed. It's not a very useful knowledge. At least it's not as useful as it will be if you study in detail. Well, sales pitch, I guess. I'm get up on my pedestal. Not a pedestal, what do you call it? When you get up on your own deal and brag your own terms. I forget the term now. That again, maybe another 6, 8 months and it'll come back to me. Anyhow, we're going to be looking at Mark 13, verses 14 through 23. A little large segment of Mark for a change. The title, The Sign. The time is now. Jesus going to finally get to the point, or Mark's finally going to get to the point that Jesus makes when he tells us that the sign of the end times wrapping up. How do you know when the end times is about to come upon us and wrap up? When the final segment of history will unfold, when history will be just that, history. But Jesus' description, again, we got to keep in mind, can apply to AD 70 as a near prophetic event, as well as the far point when history will end. In AD 70, history didn't end, of course, but much of what Jesus will describe did happen. And we'll talk about that along the way as well. Interestingly, Jesus' description fit an event that had already occurred during the intertestamental period. Between the Old Testament and the New Testament, a period of about 400 years, there was something that took place that fit what Jesus is saying will happen again. The key lies in the term abomination of desolation, or abomination that brings desolation. Let's look at this description. And again, this is Jesus still speaking on the Mount of Olives. But when you see the abomination of desolation, standing where it should not be, someplace the abomination has no right to be. Let the reader understand. Let the leaders understand it too. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So this is specifically targeted in Israel. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Abomination is a word that signifies a pagan idolatry. In this case, a pagan idolatry taking place in the temple. And that's happened in more than one case. I think you can read of it in Jeremiah. I believe you can read about it in Ezekiel. And it causes the temple to be desecrated, and therefore the people will vacate the temple, and the temple will be abandoned by the faithful. Abomination refers in this case to a person who is in the temple, but who should not be there, who has no right to be there. In some ways, Jesus, as I said earlier, was describing an event in history, in Israel's history, years before his birth, several hundred years before his birth, and before his incarnation. I say his birth and incarnation because, remember, Jesus is eternal. He has always existed. The event was a vengeful, troll again. It was a bad action of a Syrian emperor and his desire to eradicate all worship of Yahweh. What was his name? The Syrian emperor in question is called Antiochus Epiphanes IV. This was about BC 167, over 160 years before Jesus was born. Antiochus erected in the temple an altar to Zeus above or over, around, surrounding, whatever, and the altar for burnt offerings. So where burnt offerings were to sacrifice, now it was an altar to Zeus, and that Antiochus' offering was a pig, which he chose intentionally to desecrate the temple and to drive the Jews crazy. Antiochus' goal was to wipe out all worship of Yahweh. He didn't, of course, but he did empty the temple. There was no Jewish goings-on in the temple for a period of time. He was partially successful, but not completely. But Jesus' near prophetic emphasis was of AD 70. That's a history that we understand. We know what took place. The Zealots started a revolt against Rome in about AD 66 or 67. This is Zealots. Remember, one of the Zealots was one of Jesus' 12, Simon the Zealot. The Zealots put in their own high priest. In other words, they made a person high priest who was not of the priestly line. The high priest's name was Phani, Phanni, and they evidently removed the high priest who had been approved by Rome. That would have been a high priest who fit the Aaronic Aaronic, the line of Aaron. But this Fanny, however they pronounce his name, he was not. He was chosen by the zealots. When people fled at the Syrian invasion of Jerusalem, they fled to mountains in Perea. Remember, Perea is just across on the east side of the Jordan, a place called Pella, P-E-L-L-A. I don't think it has any connection to Pella Windows, but the name is spelled the same. And Christians in AD 70 flew to that exact spot. Of course, that was the event during which the temple was destroyed, along with the city of Jerusalem. Interestingly, the temple was never designed or identified as a point they wanted to destroy, the Romans. It was apparently set on fire by a drunken Roman soldier. And the fire was so intense that the gold that was on the stones was melted and ran into the cracks between the stones. And Caesar then ordered the stones separated and thrown down in an attempt to recover the melted gold. And of course the destruction was complete except for the Western Wall as we know it. Everything was thrown into the Kidron Valley, and the floor of the Kidron Valley was raised several feet because of the amount of trash thrown down. So Matthew's going to tell us something of the far event, though, that Jesus is describing in this discourse. And it comes in Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16. This is the same thing that Mark has described, but he doesn't give us all of this. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet. So he said, this was foretold by Daniel. When you see that abomination standing in the holy place, meaning within the temple, in the holy areas of the temple, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So the thing that Matthew adds is that this was told by Daniel the prophet, and it would happen at the end times. In terms of the far prophetic event, Daniel spoke of the Antichrist. That's who would be the abomination of desolation in the end times. Let me go back and read where Matthew is referring to when he speaks of Daniel. It's in Daniel 9:27. And Daniel's describing the Antichrist here, he will make a firm covenant with the many, that means with Israel, for 1 week. That's 7. But in the middle of the 7, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. As a matter of fact, what's half of 7? It's 3.5. Do some of these things ring a bell? And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So he said the person doing this is going to pay a price. And I want to jump to Daniel 11, verse 31. And forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, that would be the temple, and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of the desolation. They will desecrate the temple. And then moving on to chapter 12 of Daniel, verse 11. And from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished by this desecration, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. 1,290 days. Remember, the Jewish calendar had 360 days in a year. 360 divided into 1290 goes 3.5, 3.5. Luke adds a bit also beyond what Mark does in Luke 21, and I'm going to read two verses, verse 20 and verse 24. And he says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand." And that would have been the Roman army under Titus. "And they will fall at least for the short term, and they will fall by the edge of the sword. Yeah, bad news today. "And they will fall by the edge of the sword," that would be Jews, "and will be led captive," those not killed, will be led captive into all the nations. They will be dispersed. "And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled," which is the time described in Revelation. And Revelation speaks to that time of the Gentiles when it will be finished in Revelation 11:2. "And leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it." He's giving instructions on measuring the temple. "For it has been given to the nations," the Gentiles, "and they will tread underfoot the holy city for," and watch this, 42 months. 42 months is 3.5 years. In this final event, the abomination who should not be there in the temple will be the Antichrist, who will go to the temple and declare himself to be God. Now, Paul wrote about this too. I'm going to read from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. He sounds a bit like Christ here. "And let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come," mean the final time, "unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness," the Antichrist, "is revealed, the son of destruction, who exposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship." He is the supreme God, the Antichrist is declaring, "so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God." So Paul So it makes it very clear that the desecration is going to be to stop the worship of Yahweh, to begin the worship of the Antichrist, who is above all gods. Matthew described what follows, and look at this clearly. This is going to be rather clear what this follows, all of what Matthew, Luke, Paul have been talking about. Matthew 24, verses 29 and 31. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, and how the word tribulation in those days, the Great Tribulation, fits 7 years, 3.5 years. Says, after those days, after the Great Tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky, which is from Daniel also, and from Christ during his trial, with power and great glory, not coming as a baby. He's coming as one with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels. What's the excuse me. What's the first he does? Excuse me. He will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect. He will gather all true Christian believers from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, many people will think that's referring to only Jews. I think it's referring to all Christians. But Jesus went on to speak of the urgency and the tribulation of the evacuation of Jerusalem during this time. So we're going to switch back to Mark now, chapter 13, verses 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. 15 through 19. And Mark writes, as words from Jesus, let him who is on the housetop not go down or enter in to get anything out of his house. It said, don't go back into the house. If you're outside, stay outside. Let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. Keep him warm at night, I guess, like his coat. So if you're outside, don't go back in. But woe to those who are with child, and to those who nurse babies, because now being pregnant and to be feeding an infant means you have a problem relative to what is needed. But pray, verse 18, but pray that it may not happen in the winter, for those days will be a time of tribulation such has not occurred since. So this is the end of the Great Tribulation. Verse 18, but pray that it may not happen in the winter, for those days will be a time of tribulation such has not occurred since. Not since the beginning of creation which God created until now, and never shall be again. I'm added be again, but that's what it's talking about. So Daniel said something like verse 19, and I'll read 12:1 from Daniel. Now at that time Michael, the great prince who stands guard, meaning over Israel, over the sons of your people Israel, will arise. So there's Michael the angel will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. So Daniel says something similar to what Mark has written that Jesus claimed, but he says, notice, everyone whose name is in the book will be rescued. There's your endurance again. So again, Jesus is speaking of the urgency of those in Jerusalem to flee to avoid being killed by the Roman army in AD 70 and whoever the collection of nations gathered against Jerusalem is in the end times. In both cases, people are going to be told to get out now. And that's why he said, hope you're not pregnant or have a young infant you have to take with you. That could pose a problem. It would seem that verse 19, as we mentioned, shifts the focus to Jesus' second advent following the Great Tribulation. At that point, it looks like God is not in control, but Jesus goes on to tell us, ain't true. God remains in control. I'm going to read Mark 13, verse 20. And unless the Lord had shortened those days, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. God will take care of you if you are among the elect, which means that you simply are a believer, have accepted Christ as your Savior. And you got there because God chose you. It would seem that God acted sovereignly to ensure there would be living ones among the elect to be present at Jesus' return. We don't want Jesus to come back and everybody's dead. That sounds like what is said. One gets a picture that verse 20 likely is limited to those believers present in Jerusalem at that time, because it was speaking of what, if you're in Jerusalem when this takes place, here's what you do. If you're in Airway Heights when this takes place, something different will take place. But earlier, Jesus said, and this is in Mark 13:13, earlier than the end times anyhow, you will be hated by all on account of my name. You will be hated strictly because you're a believer. We mentioned this moments earlier. But the one who endures to the end shall be saved. So Jesus finishes with a repeat of his earlier warning. We see that in Mark 13, 21, 22, and 23. And then, if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or behold, he is there, he's here, he's there, don't believe that guy. Don't believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise. It's exactly what he said earlier, particularly in verse 13. And will show signs and wonders. In other words, going to be able to look as though he's creating true miracles, in order, if possible, to lead the elect astray. Mark's saying that's what he's trying to do, trying to take people from the kingdom out of the kingdom. He said, but take heed and behold, I have told you everything in advance. What he just said, God ain't going to let Satan steal people from the kingdom. He ain't going to let that happen. It seems that Satan will provide the false claimants to the Messiahship with some powers, maybe supernatural powers, to either do true miracles or to fake true miracles. It doesn't really matter. Their purpose is to deceive, whether it's a true miracle or not. But Jesus makes it clear with the if possible that those guys who are doing that, those false miracles, will not be successful in leading true believers away from the kingdom and into error. Believers who hear Jesus' words will not be led astray. Jesus will guard his own. Yahweh will guard his own. But what's coming up next? Well, we'll take a check of Mark's description of Jesus' return and the lesson of the fig tree. Not the fig tree that Jesus withered, but the fig tree that typically represents Israel. So,